I'm going to be sharing the process of how I illustrated my new book, The Gnome with No Name, which is written by Katie Ford. But yeah, so in this video, I'm going to share how to create the illustrations, character design, rough illustrations, final illustrations. It doesn't matter if you're working digitally or traditionally. The first book that I did, I worked with coloured pencils and then I scanned them in and did a little bit of digital editing. Nowadays, I predominantly work on my iPad. I love my iPad. It's really intuitive. I feel like for drawing, it feels very natural and it's just so much easier to make changes digitally than it is if you were doing them traditionally. So currently I prefer drawing digitally on my iPad in an app called Procreate, but it doesn't matter if you want to draw digitally or traditionally. Neither one is right or wrong. But yeah, I still spend hours and hours and hours drawing digitally. So whilst I do find it a little bit quicker, and I did manage to complete The Gnome with No Name in 3.5 months, that was also partly because I didn't have any other projects at the same time and I was working quite long hours. So I think there are merits to both, and I'm going to talk you through these and also share part of my process for that as well. I think it is a really good idea when you're planning out your book to decide the size. If you're going to want to print your book through KDP or Ingram Sparks, then double check what sizes they do, because you don't want to create the illustrations and then find out they don't actually do that book size. One of the sizes that I really like to do is 8 by 10 inches. You can also do square books. So this is 8.5 inches. So if you have a look on KDP's website, it will list all the different sizes. And then if you look over to the right, it will then list the size including bleed. When books get printed, they get printed and then they get trimmed. So if you want your illustrations to be full bleed, that means you want the illustrations to go right to the edge of the page. So right to the edge of the cover, and on the inside, you want the illustrations to go right to the edge. So that is full bleed. In order to achieve this, you actually need to extend your illustration. But yes, it's a very good idea to set up your pages in advance. I would set up a double page spread before you actually do your thumbnails and before you do your final illustrations. I use Photoshop, but you could also use Affinity Photo, which is very similar. I know some people use Canva as well. And what you want to do is set up a template that has a left page and a right page. But yeah, so when you set up your file, make sure it's in CMYK, because that is the color profile that you would want for printing. With the resolution, it's best to have at least 300 dpi. You could also have more. Sometimes I go up to 600 dpi, although it's probably not necessary. 300 dpi is probably going to be fine. Sometimes I just like to work a little bit bigger just in case I want to print a very large art print or something afterwards. So double check what book size you're doing and what the size including the bleed will be. So if your width is 8 inches, it will then become 16 inches, and then you're adding 1/8 of an inch onto the left and the right, so that becomes 16.25 inches. Yeah, we don't need to double the height, so that's just going to be 10 inches plus the 1/8 bleed at the top and the bottom. So next I will add the margins, and on Photoshop you go to View and Add New Guide and add in 0.125 inches. You can do this vertically, horizontally, and you can also just drag the margins down, and you have these rulers on the side, so you can just eyeball it. I like to add a margin in the middle. So to do this, you add a new guide and you type in 50%, and then this will split your canvas into two, giving you a left page and a right page. I then go ahead and add a safe zone. You need a safe zone because in the printing process, if they accidentally cut off more than they're meant to, you just want a safe zone to make sure that there's nothing important that could accidentally get chopped off. I'm just adding in some lines here. So the line tool is over here on the left, and I'm just holding down Shift so that it's nice and straight. If I didn't hold down Shift, then it might be slightly wonky. And yep, so I'm just copying all of our margins. So then I will save that as my template and then I'll open it up in Procreate. If you have an Apple computer and an iPad, it's easier to transfer, but I end up using Dropbox so that I can transfer files over. You could also email it to yourself as well. Okay, so now we have our template with our margins, and we can just twist this round if we want this landscape mode instead. So to add a new layer, just go to these two little squares and click Add Layer. I have renamed this layer as our margins layer, but yeah, to rename, click there, click Rename, and you can name it whatever you would like. I'm going to drag our margins layer up there, and I'm going to change this from normal to multiply, and then that will just get rid of all the white so we can see what's underneath, and then I'm just going to lock that, and then we have our margins. And now we can draw. La 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 la. To undo, you tap with 2 fingers, and to redo, you tap with 3 fingers, and then you can zoom in or zoom out just by pinching your fingers together or further away. You can change the size here, change the opacity on this one. Generally, I don't change the opacity. I'd rather keep it all the way up, but you will notice if you, hang on, let's make this brush bigger. If you push down really hard, it's darker. If you apply less pressure, it gets lighter. If you click here on this paintbrush, you have all different brushes here. Some of these brushes are brushes that I have added. Yeah, Procreate also added a whole load of new brushes as well. But yeah, so if you've never used Procreate before, I would definitely play around with what the different brushes are like. So you have pencils, you have markers, different kind of paints. If you want to change the color, then just click on this circle, and you can create your own color palette. So click the plus, create a new color palette. But yeah, I don't really use the smudge tool, so but if you did, that just blurs things like that, but I don't use that tool. And then this is the erase tool. And with the erase tool, you can also select what type of brush you would like. So I stick to the same brush, generally this chunky pencil brush. And you can change the size. Over on this side, you can, this is a selection tool. So you have freehand automatic rectangle. So yeah, you can just draw, select that whole area. If you drag 3 fingers down, you can then open up this box. You can cut this, copy, duplicate, etc. So we can just cut that. Then you have a few things over here. So you have adjustments. So you can change the hue, saturation, brightness, etc, etc. Change the hue, saturation. So if we wanted it more saturated, we could do that. We could change the color a bit if we want to. If you want any drawing guides on, if you click the spanner and click drawing guides, it will give you a grid, and you can edit this grid if you like to make it bigger or smaller. And you can also do symmetry as well. So you can have it in the middle, options, you can have it horizontal, quadrant, etc. And then once your artwork is finished and you want to export it, go back to gallery, click select, click on this dot here, click share, and then you can choose the image format. Generally, I like to save things as TIFFs. You could also save as a JPEG, although be warned that if you are constantly opening and editing a JPEG, then it will lose the quality. So I'm going to save it as a TIFF, and then you can export it. So if you have an Apple computer, you can just airdrop it. But like I said, I like to use Dropbox. So I will just use Dropbox, and yeah, you just click upload. With working digitally, I just find it easier when I'm working with authors, because if they have any feedback and they want me to change things, it's a lot easier to do that on the iPad than it is with traditional illustrations. You can absolutely do this traditionally as well. But yeah, if you work with paints or pencils or oil pastels, if you do work traditionally, you're going to have to either scan your illustrations in, or you can also take a photograph of them. Bear in mind that if you're taking a photograph, you need to be really careful, because you want to make sure that your camera is really straight when you're positioning yourself over the top of your artwork. I would advise scanning over taking a photograph, just because if you are slightly out with the camera, it will just be slightly distorted. And also if the lighting isn't completely unified, it just won't look as good as scanning it. So if you don't have a scanner yourself, then you could go to a local printers and you could get them to scan it in for you. So when I scan things, I scan them via Photoshop. I am also able to scan using the program Windows Fax and Scan, but for some reason, even if I change the DPI to 600, the quality of the scan never looks as good as when I scan it in Photoshop. You can get a free 7-day trial of Photoshop, but if you know of a good scanning software that isn't Photoshop, then do let me know in the comments. So in order to scan, you go to File, Import, WIA Support, and this, like I said, is on a Windows computer. Yeah, click Start, select your printer and press OK, and you want a color picture. Then you want to adjust the resolution. So yeah, do 300 or 600. Then you can either click preview or you can just click scan. It might take a while. Okay, so here is one of my illustrations that has been scanned in. This wasn't for a book project. This was actually for some Christmas decorations that I designed. So once your artwork's been scanned in, you will probably need to make a few subtle edits. I am just cropping this because I don't need the background here. So I feel like if I just crop it to the area that I need, that's fine. And if this was going to be a book illustration, then obviously I would then transfer it onto that double page template that we made earlier. So I'm going to make a few adjustments to this illustration. So up the top, if you go to Image, Adjustments, Levels, then I clicked on the white dropper tool, clicked on the white space, which automatically made everything nice and white. And then I moved the midtones down, which is the grey one, and I moved the shadows down a little bit, and you can preview this and turn that button off and on, and then just click OK when you're ready. Then I went back into Image Adjustments and clicked Hue Saturation. Yeah, I'm going to leave the hue as it is. I was just wanting to increase the saturation a little bit. You don't want to do this too much, but you might find that if you scan your illustrations, they look a little bit duller than they do in real life. And now I'm cutting out the background. So first of all, I'm using the selection tool to select all this white space. And as you can see, there's a few little sort of specks, which probably was created because this was colored pencil. So they're like tiny little specks of like the pencil dust and stuff. So now I'm using the lasso tool, and I'm holding Shift on my keyboard to add to the selection. If you needed to take away from the selection, then hold down Alt instead. And once I've got everything selected and I'm happy with that, I just click delete on my keyboard and that removes the background. Another tool that you might find useful if you work traditionally is a light box. So I've got one of these. It's basically a flat light. You plug it in, it lights up, and you can have a couple of pieces of paper on top of each other, and it means you can trace your own drawings. What I would do is I would create my thumbnails and then I'd layer this underneath, and then on a new piece of paper I would create the final illustrations. And if you're going to do this, you could also draw out where your margins were going to be on a rough piece of paper and maybe where you want the text and your thumbnails, and it would just make it a lot more easier to then do your final illustrations. So now I'm going to move on to sharing how I illustrated the gnome with no name. In it, our main character, the gnome, is wrapped up in bubble wrap and left on a shelf to gather dust. Then two children find him and, he goes on a bit of an adventure. So there's an important message about not being too overprotective and the kind of joy of playing. But yeah, so that's a little bit about the premise of the book. And I'm going to take you through the whole process. So one of the first things that I do is design the character art. So the main character in our story is Chip. He's the gnome in the story. Katie wanted him to be kind of like a grandfather-y figure. So we've drawn him with a beard, but we didn't want to make him look too much like Santa. So we're steering clear of like red hats. Originally, this is the first character art that I did of Chip. I made him quite bright and colourful, and I gave him this yellow hat, and he had like a checkered shirt, yellow boots, and a sunflower on his dungarees. Katie really liked him, but the feedback that she gave was she wanted there to be kind of like a transformation of Chip in the story. So there's two kids that are in the story. They find the gnome and they give him a bit of a makeover, which was a really, really fun scene to illustrate. Yeah, because they give him a makeover and they make him a little bit more fun, Katie sort of wanted to have that contrast between the gnome being a little bit more kind of serious to start with and then a bit more playful when the kids have given him the makeover. So we decided to go for like some muted colours for his outfit, and I've done a whole load of different colour options here, and the one that we went with was this one with the red spade, which I think is fun because then it gives it a bit more of a pop of colour. And we also decided in the end to stick with the yellow boots. When he has his makeover, he gets this sunflower on his hat and some nice rainbow arms, and the kids also stick like some stickers and other things on him. The other thing I had to consider with colour palette, I wanted to make sure the colour of the gnome wasn't going to get lost in the background. But yeah, so I went for this kind of like dark teal green hat as opposed to a green that was closer to the shade of the grass, because I feel like that would just get lost. Similarly, the dungarees, it's not like a sky blue. So usually with the character design, I like to also show their different emotions and like facial expressions, and also do this with body language. Now, the gnome in our story is a little bit different because the author, Katie, wanted him to be in a fixed position and to have a fixed expression. And she just liked the idea of the gnome being in like difficult and sort of dangerous situations, and for the audience to be worried for him, but for him to have this kind of like smiling expression on his face and just like the humour of that. So because I couldn't show the expression in the gnome's face, I wanted to make sure that I did a good job of doing the expressions on the dad's and the kid's face. For my character sheets of the gnome, I made sure that I had different references of him from different angles, and when I came to do the thumbnails, I wanted to make sure that I had the gnome seen from different angles and like more zoomed in, more zoomed out, just to add some variety to that. Once I've done the character art, I move on to the thumbnails, which is a really fun and exciting part of the process, but also one of the most challenging because you have lots of different decisions to make. So as you can see, I have got my margins and I've got the text all set up on this thumbnail, and I believe this text did change, but the space that I allocated for the text stayed the same. And my thumbnails are very rough to start with, literally just stick figures, and then I'll use my character reference sheet along with any kind of references of people in the poses that I need. As you can see, sometimes I draw things a bit bigger and then I shrink it down to the size that I want it. And again, that is one of the handy things of working digitally, particularly when you're doing the thumbnails. And in fact, even when I was working on Mother Seagull and the Ocean King and I worked with coloured pencil, I actually did the thumbnails on my iPad, but then printed them out, and then I used my Lightbox so that I could trace over my thumbnails. Yeah, so even when I was working traditionally, I still found the iPad really useful for helping me out with composition. And yeah, you can see towards the end, I'm making a few changes. We played around with having some different postures with the dad's hands, and we went with a kind of the universal symbol for stop with his hands raised, and we also tweaked the facial expressions a little bit because Katie wanted to make sure that the dad was looking a little bit more stern and that the kids were looking a bit more anxious. I try to vary doing different compositions by having things from slightly different angles or a little bit more zoomed in or zoomed out. You don't need to do exactly what is being said in the text. Obviously, you want it to go together to an extent, but for example, I have pages in the book where the children are not mentioned in the text, but I have put them in the background. So in this page, it doesn't actually mention the children at all. It's just talking about the gnome being created, but because the children are one of the main characters and obviously children reading the story, they want to see other children, I wanted to make sure they featured as much as possible and just to give them something really fun to look at. Another thing for the kids to spot in the story are the cats. There are 2 cats in the story which are based on cats that belong to Katie's niece and nephew, and they pop up throughout the story, so it was really fun to put them in the background. Yeah, mostly I think the cats are just like curled up somewhere. But yeah, Katie knows me well because she knows I love gardens, I love cats, so this was definitely the perfect project to work on. So yeah, you can always include things in your illustrations that aren't actually said on the page. So for the final illustrations, like I said, I draw these on my iPad using Procreate. Yeah, and I love the 6B pencil, and I have a digital set of brushes that I bought from Design Cuts. They do various different brushes for like Photoshop and Procreate, and I got their pencil pack, which has these really nice sort of pencil textures, as you might imagine. So I'm going to take you through the process of doing one of my favourite illustrations of the gnome in the pond. So originally the gnome was going to be fully submerged in the water, water, but on one of the previous illustrations the kids had just been giving him a makeover, so Katie didn't want the water in the pond to like wash away any of his paint, so we thought we'd just kind of dunk the bottom half of him in the water. So I'll put up on the screen what the thumbnail looked like. Here I'm just adding a few more details to it because I didn't actually do the details of the dress on the girl here, so I was just adding that in, and I also decided to add a frog. I thought that would be quite nice to have some wildlife, and also I've added these dragonflies as well. Once I'm happy with the additional details that I've added, I then merged all of that down and reduced the opacity, which you do by clicking on the N on the layer, and then you can just drag that down, and then once that's lowered then I lock that layer, just because I want to make sure that I'm not accidentally drawing on that layer by mistake. So then I create a new layer that is for my final line art. Yeah, and so I'm just making a cleaner version than the rough illustration. How rough or neat you make it is up to you. I think there is a bit of a correlation with the neater that you make something, sometimes you can kind of lose some of that spontaneity and looseness. So yeah, I'm always trying to work out where the line is between making something more detailed and also kind of keeping that looseness and playfulness. So the final artwork does obviously take longer to do than the thumbnails, but in some ways the final artwork is easier because in the thumbnails you're having to make so many decisions about the composition, and in the final artwork you kind of can switch your brain off a little bit. It's a bit more of a sort of therapeutic process. I find that I can actually listen to videos, I can listen to podcasts, music at this stage, whereas if I'm trying to do any kind of decision making, so in the thumbnail stage, I can't really listen to that. And sometimes I even find it hard to listen to music with lyrics because if I'm trying to like concentrate, I find that like really difficult to focus on. You don't need to outline everything either, which I have mentioned before as well. That just again is a kind of personal preference, sort of like style wise. And if you look at lots of different artists, some people will outline a lot more than this and they'll go really, really into loads of detail. Other people will maybe be a bit more kind of like Quentin Blake and have very loose line work and maybe colour outside the lines as well. So yeah, there's no kind of like hard and fast rule. I'm just kind of sharing my process. So don't feel that you have to do your final illustrations exactly the same way that I do them or exactly the same way as somebody else does them, but I do find it helpful to kind of see how different people work. Yeah, so do let me know in the comments as well how you like to do your final illustrations. Then I move on to doing the colour. So I create a colour palette for every different project that I do, and in Procreate, yeah, you can create various different colour palettes, which is very handy because otherwise I will probably use all the colours, which I do to an extent, but there are certain key colours that we keep coming back to. And Katie really wanted the girl to be wearing mustard yellow, so you will see her throughout the book in this mustard yellow colour. She also wears a yellow coat, yeah, and she has a few different outfits throughout the book where she's wearing mustard yellow. But yes, it can be very handy to have a colour palette. And when I was working on Mother Seagull and the Ocean King, I had like a pot of pencils that I would put all the pencils I was using into that pot, and I would also wrap washi tape around them as well, just so that I knew that those were the ones that were in my colour palette. And then once you're finished with that project, you can take that washi tape off. I really wanted to show some of the underwater scene in the pond. Like I said, originally it was my plan to fully submerge the gnome in the water. Because he was just being dunked on the surface, I thought it would be fun to still show kind of like the underwater scene. I did the effect of making the underwater bits really dark, and then the surface of the water, I sort of added all this tiny little kind of green pondy plants on the top of the water. And I quite like how the kids are actually dunking their feet in the pond as well. So it's like the kids are having a dip in the pond, and the gnome is as well, which I thought was quite a nice little touch. So I thought I'd share one more illustration. I'm working on the line art here, and what I like to do is I line everything and then I go back and I do this nice kind of like soft pencil texture. Quite often I will use more of the edge of the pencil, kind of like you would when you're drawing traditionally as well. If you use the edge of a pencil, it comes out a little bit softer than if you use the point of a pencil. I'm just going round and just adding like all the shadows in, and I do add shadow in with colour as well later on, but this is just a technique that I like, and I'm basically trying to mirror how I would actually draw with coloured pencil. And now I'm adding colour, and like I mentioned before, Katie wanted the girl to be wearing mustard yellow, so here she is in her mustard yellow coat. The colour palette that I chose for the gnome with no name is fairly bright, so lots of yellows, blues, greens, reds can be very useful to make those decisions to start with, especially if you're somebody who ends up getting decision paralysis. This is from a scene where the kids are splashing in puddles and it's set in spring. I love spring flowers, so I was really excited to add lots of tulips and daffodils. Autumn is actually my favourite season, but I think spring is a close second. And like I mentioned, this book does go through the seasons. The majority of the book is in summer, where a lot of the adventures are taking place. It was really fun to like explore the different seasons in the book, try and work out what flowers might be in season and like the different weather they might have as well. And in the previous scene to this, there's just been a storm. So again, this is another example where I've added something that's happening in the illustration that wasn't actually mentioned in the text. So Katie didn't ask me to draw the kids jumping in puddles, but because the previous scene there was a storm, I thought it would be fun to show the next day where there was loads of rain puddles and the kids were just having fun jumping in all the puddles. So another thing that I have added in this illustration is this pigeon in the tree, and actually in the next scene we see the pigeon. So that is another fun thing, just to kind of, if something is going to happen in your story, to add it before the kind of action happens. Then when you're reading it with kids, they might spot it. Potentially they might spot it on their first read, or if it's a story that they're quite familiar with and they know something happens with the pigeon, they might point it out to you the next time that you read it. Thanks so much for watching this video. If you want to get a copy of any of my books, the links to those will be in the description. So we have The Gnome with No Name, Puffy Puffs Up. Both of those are by Katie Ford. And then we have Can Babies Eat Sushi by Danielle Colding, Positive P by Ashley Thompson, and Mother Seagull and the Ocean King by John Shepherd. All the links to those are in the description. I hope you've really enjoyed this video, and if you missed the first part about how to put this all together, how to put your KDP files or your Ingram Spark files together, then go and check out the other video. And I'm sending you lots of love. I hope you've had a wonderful day, wonderful week, and I will see you in my next video. Okay, bye.
Thank you for coming. I know that you're trying to do anything to make me smile.